push through some slides, maybe skip some slides. They are in the presentation, so you can certainly go back and look at them. But I did want to make some key points, and so I'll sort of talk about those, make sure that they come out. But with all the discussion about the architectural changes, the platform changes, and so on, it wouldn't go amiss to talk about security and its impact in terms of the new architecture for 5G systems and so on. So there's two aspects to security that I wanted to bring up. One is the security of the actual services that are consumed. And we talked about a number of use cases there, from the enhanced mobile broadband connectivity to the machine type communications and the ultra reliable critical communications, low latency critical communications. All of those have different requirements from a security standpoint, but as delivering the services, you can't design the system for the maximum security for all of those systems. The ultra reliable systems require a high degree of security, so over-engineering the system is not the right way of doing it, but designing it just right for the specific service that's being consumed is extremely critical for 5G systems. And on the left-hand side here, I'm outlining some of the requirements from the services perspective that draw upon security. Two that I wanted to draw out. It's messed up a little bit. Okay, so I already talked about the use cases, so I'm not going to draw on that, but two things that I want to draw out relative to 4G systems and earlier on that are affected from a security standpoint is the availability and resiliency. And that's extremely critical for the ultra-reliable, low-latency communication systems, like autonomous vehicles, for example. These requirements were really not there from a 4G system perspective. The availability was really reliant on the MNO-owned infrastructure and good control of the infrastructure, both in terms of what's being developed for them and what they're purchasing, but also in terms of operational aspects of it. So the availability was implicit in the vendor relationships that they had and the deployment model of the infrastructure. The resiliency was really not there. It's been drawn upon more with regards to the ultra-reliable, low-latency communications connectivity requirements, but also some of the other use cases. But the resiliency aspect of it comes into play in terms of being able to say, if I want to deliver a service, I need a particular QoS. Can I ensure that my system is resilient under all circumstances to actually deliver those services? And some of the discussions that we had about the architectural changes from the perspective of network slicing and so on actually brings in some useful features that help towards the resiliency, but also from a security standpoint, considerations for resiliency are critically important for 5G systems. The other aspect that I want to draw out is the overall integrity of the networks and the systems themselves. One of the nice things about having network slices is, as Raghu said, you can tailor a slice towards a particular use case and a service. Nice thing about that is, as a result of the architectural approach, there's an isolation of the network slices as well. So if there's some security vulnerability that occurs on an ultra-high speed network like an eMBB type service, then you can isolate that from a critical communication slice, for example. So the ability to have this network slice architecture brings in some nice features that are appealing from a security standpoint. So one of the things that we've been doing in terms of the infrastructure is moving from essentially dedicated boxes to HOTS platforms, servers and compute platforms and switches and routers. What that does is, on the one hand, it brings a more reliability in terms of standard platforms that the network communication software is running on. And then on the other hand, it also brings in some vulnerabilities, because these platforms are essentially sitting out there, broadly speaking, in the internet, and sometimes in environments that the MNO doesn't have full control of. In the traditional sense, the infrastructure, I think I have a slide later on that talks to this, but in the traditional sense, the infrastructure components, the boxes that the MNOs purchase from the Nokias, Ericsson, Huawei's and so on, are essentially put into an environment that the MNO controls, i.e. the building is their own building, the infrastructure sits in the building that they control. they have full access rights in terms of who goes in, who comes out of those buildings. And the communications connection into those buildings where the equipment is situated is under full control of the MNOs. Now, when we look at the network slice architecture, where the equipment essentially is sitting on servers, where those servers may actually be third-party owned and controlled and managed, you've got a situation where basically the MNO is reliant on a third party on the physical security of the platforms. And secondly, because they're servers and compute platforms which are virtualized, they could easily be sharing a server with some other third-party entity. So you've got an environment where essentially you have infrastructure that's highly distributed and heterogeneous, and secondly, infrastructure that's actually, as opposed to 4G systems and earlier, shared across multiple vendors, multiple third parties. So that, in a way, creates a sort of security vulnerability as well, and an opportunity as well going forward. So, just summarizing what I was saying in terms of the infrastructure sort of appeal, I think when we look at it from traditional systems and move down into the 5G systems, you've lost this concept of having a firewall around your equipment. You've lost this notion of having a demilitarized zone that you can create around your equipment towards a more softer partitioning between the network components and the gluing of the components to create the services. So from a security standpoint, there's 3 or 4 things that drop out. 3 key ones that involve new requirements. The service delivery models are different relative to what they were in the past with this network slice type of architecture. The threat landscape is evolving. It's not the same sort of threats that you're facing. You're facing an additional set of threats because you've now got a situation where the MNOs are operating on platforms that are third-party owned. And with some of the use cases, there's an increased focus on privacy. So for example, autonomous vehicles, there's a key need to sort of prevent the identity of the vehicles being tracked by third parties that may be eavesdropping on the conversations and so on. So there's a pressing need to assure for some of the use cases a level of privacy. Today's system, if you're making a call, it's very easy to pick up the identity of your phone and trace you. With 5G systems, some of the use cases are demanding that the ability to isolate the identity and maintain the privacy of individuals becomes a critical need. And then the fourth one, because of that highly distributed model, the notion of trust in 4G and earlier systems is that I have a vendor relationship with you, I have a service level agreement with you, therefore I trust you. That's obvious in the case of Wi-Fi systems, for example, Wi-Fi access points. Either you're known by the MNO in terms of this is a Wi-Fi access point that I've got a service level agreement with you or not, or you don't. And that's the definition of trust basically in today's systems. With the architectural shift, the notion of that definition of trust really disappears or becomes very difficult to administer because there's multiple vendors that are offering different parts of the network and multiple players involved that it just becomes prohibitive to develop contractual relationships with all of the third parties that eventually end up delivering the services. So one of the key things from a security standpoint that's emerging is the development of new trust models which are essentially analytical in nature to develop a level of trust in the infrastructure. I'm not going to dwell on this. These are sort of some of the key areas from a security standpoint that have been studied by the standards organizations in terms of defining security requirements. And the last point that I was making in regards to the trust of the infrastructure and the trust model, the virtualization security is a key part of that, and the security assurances that can be developed is another key part of that. I'll just retrace again in terms of, if you look at systems from a security standpoint, then these are typically the sort of class of services that you're looking at. In 5G, the availability, privacy, and the non-repudiation has become much more of a forefront requirement. In the past, it's been a low-level requirement that's been implicitly achieved. In 5G, it's become much more pressing to provide those features from a security standpoint. I'm going to sort of just roll forward a little bit and skip a couple of slides because I think I've sort of talked to them already, and sort of roll into a summary. Sorry, the slide's been moved around a bit, sorry about that. So if we, in summary, if we look at the 5G systems from a security standpoint, then one, you've got this challenge that we're faced with regards to the infrastructure, highly distributed, heterogeneous in nature. How do you deal with the notion of trusting the infrastructure and the components in the infrastructure? The good thing is that there are technologies in the sort of internet computing side that actually go a long way towards addressing this problem. And so the notion of trusted computing and trusted platforms comes into play in terms of addressing some of these requirements from an infrastructure security perspective. Second one is the service security, the ability to provide a variable level of security for the different use cases, and to take into consideration the notion of availability and resilience of the network from a security standpoint. And if we look at what's happening in terms of the architectures that we talked about earlier on, the CIPRI architecture in terms of some of the front-end radio processing, the ability to do virtualized processing, the slice architecture, there's some nice things that fall out of that that help address security from a 5G